So we're picking up in chapter 18 with European competition and cooperation, empire building in Africa. And this has happened again, so I'm so sorry about that overlap there. But we're picking up with gender relations in colonization. And it's important to remember that the Europeans who were traveling overseas for trade were almost entirely male. And they frequently entered into sexual liaisons with prostitutes. And as they stayed longer, these relationships became increasingly important. One, to fulfill their sexual desires, but more importantly, to help them with business. The Senegal Company, for instance, forbade traders to marry local women. So they would take mistresses among the locals, and these women would help them negotiate local languages. They would serve as translators. They would help them adjust to local customs and health conditions. In India, on the other hand, the Nawabs were allowed to marry locals, so they did, and they produced lots of Anglo-Indian children. But as time went on, Europeans began to bring their wives to the colonies, or they would bring their families, or other women would come along seeking marriage. And so more rigid sexual boundaries were established between Europeans and locals. And in both India and Africa, these mistress-type relationships became fewer and fewer. And in addition to that, more marriage laws were even put into place. In India, for instance, with the help of William Wilberforce, the British ended the practice of, I'm guessing it's sati, but this was where widows were forced by law to lay on their husband's funeral pyre and burn alive while he was cremated. And this was enshrined in law, so that's what they did. And this practice to Europeans was obviously terrible. So the British ended that practice in India, and they also introduced a minimum age of marriage so that older men couldn't take 9 and 10-year-old girls to be their wives. And they also urged widows to remarry since they were no longer being cremated on the funeral pyre. In Africa, they worked to end polygamy, and in some places they introduced new patterns of gender relations based on European models, like education for women and marrying for love and not for financial reasons, freedom of choice in marriage, and in China, an end to the foot binding practice. In some of these places, though, there were nationalist movements that encouraged the people to reject some of these European practices. So, anti-colonial revolts. In some cases, European colonization did not arouse bitterness among the colonized. In those places, natives found new jobs, they were given an education, and by and large received business and professional opportunities that they wouldn't have had they not been colonized. And some even praised the imperial powers for bringing peace among otherwise warring factions, not to mention the new medical and technological advancements that helped to increase the standard of living. For the most part, though, the conquered people or the colonized were resentful, and they appreciated the benefits of being a part of a large empire, but they hated the looting of local treasuries and the imposition of taxes. And as colonial administration was introduced, even qualified natives were kept out of higher level jobs in favor of Europeans. And so, not to mention, they didn't like that the new education systems would undermine local customs and traditions. And they usually even began to speak the European language in public, forcing them to abandon their native language. So most of the revolts that happened were revolts that looked backward. People wanted to restore local customs, restore the local culture, and the institutions that preceded colonialism. So that brings us to Japan, from isolation to equality. And when Japan was faced with military attacks in 1853, they recognized that they had to update their institutions and their society. They wouldn't be able to ward off European attacks, or any attacks for that matter, for long if they did not modernize. So we'll start with the end of the shogunate. So we talked about previously that Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan into an open trading relationship, and Japan had to engage that because they lacked the means to resist Matthew Perry and the Americans. So again, foreigners were granted extraterritoriality. Again, that is when you commit a crime in Japan, but you get to go back to your homeland to be tried for that crime, where your courts will probably favor you a little bit more. So foreigners were given extraterritoriality and were permitted to determine Japanese tariff policies. Unlike China, though, when this happened, young Japanese leaders seized control of their government and dramatically restructured politics, administration, the economy, class structure, technology, and culture. And these leaders were a part of the Han, and these were the younger samurai warriors. And they recognized that Japan was not capable of handling any threat unless they modernized. So they coined the motto, Eastern Ethics, Western Science. Basically, we'll accept the science, the technology, the medicine, the education, but we'll maintain Eastern ethics. We'll keep our traditional morals and values and things like that. Not everyone agreed with that, and there was a group with another motto, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian or the foreigner. And so fighting broke out between these two groups, and this eventually resulted in the Meiji Restoration. And this ended the power of the shogun. And the shogun was, it's just this word right here, the ATE is just the title for the office in general. But the shogun was a military dictator in Japan during the period from about 1190 to 1865. And this was a hereditary position. So this was the military dictator who actually held power in Japan. So they did away with that position, and they brought to power the daimyo. And I think this may be one of your vocab words in your text. But the daimyo was a group of like feudal lords who had previously controlled lots and lots of territory because they owned a lot of land. But the daimyo came to power, and the young samurai came to assume some power. But the emperor was restored. That's what the Meiji Restoration is talking about. They restored the emperor to the throne. And he took the throne at the age of 14 and reigned over this national transformation. So what was the Meiji Restoration? The new leaders of Japan, these young samurai, sent people overseas to find an acceptable model of leadership and to deepen relationships with the heads of state who had created these treaties. And they took 54 students with them. On top of that, they set up a Ministry of Education, and they sent 250 students to study abroad. And many of them, when they came back, turned out to be leaders of Japan. The Meiji rulers also brought in Americans to introduce large-scale farming practices and to teach natural and social sciences. They brought in German doctors to teach medicine. And so this was really a complete restructuring. So restructuring the government. The emperor, 14-year-old Meiji emperor, was moved to Edo, which was then renamed Tokyo in 1868. And in order to show unity, the daimyo, or this group of feudal lords who had owned lots of land, gave up 4 very large estates to the emperor to build his palace. And this just showed that they were unified. The daimyo did retain certain rights to tax collection, and they received a stipend from the government to ensure their loyalty. But they were unified with the emperor. In 1889, a constitution was created with a bicameral government, or a 2-house government. They had an elected parliament called the Diet, a diet. It's just like a council or a meeting group. But democracy was restricted. Only the nobility voted for the House of Peers, and only about 1% of the population could vote for the House of Representatives. But there was at least a tiny element in there of representation and democracy. But the Constitution was not viewed like an institution of the people. It was presented as a gift from the emperor, but he still technically retained the right to executive powers, including the right to make war and the right to make peace and negotiate treaties and things like that. On top of that, a new army was established in 1871, and much of the modern equipment that they used was even manufactured in Japan. So just 30 years before this was like a closed off, very traditional, not modern country. And in just a few years' time, they were updating like every structure of government, education, military, pretty much everything. They modeled their army on the German model. They modeled their navy on the British model. And they even wore Western-style uniforms and shoes. And Japan was quickly becoming the most powerful nation in East Asia. So restructuring the economy. So Japan first built up its agriculture, which provided more food and the profits and doorway to urban industry. And this was sort of how it played out in Great Britain too when the Industrial Revolution first began. It started with an agricultural revolution. And this happened in Japan as well. They used new seeds, new fertilizers, new methods were implemented, and agricultural colleges even opened up throughout the island to teach agricultural practices. And agricultural production increased by 30% in the 1880s and by 100% between 1890 and 1915. They were producing food crops and tea and silk. This really didn't help the peasants very much because the profits went to the landlords, and the poorer peasants were sort of squeezed off the land by high rents and high taxes. Why they were taxing the poorest peasants, I'm not sure, but they were using the taxes from the peasants to fund industrialization and militarization, to build up the army and to build up industry. And in the case of Japan, the government was the entrepreneur of industry. They built the railroads, they financed the coal mines, the iron mines, the factories, the textile mills, and even weapons manufacturing. Interestingly, the industry that contributed the most to exports, making up 40% of Japanese exports, was silk. And this was actually developed mostly by private entrepreneurs. So cultural and educational changes. Most cities had somewhere an amusement quarters that would have theaters, restaurants, artistic culture, geisha entertainers, sometimes prostitutes, actually most of the time prostitutes. But the social networks in Japan were really based on neighborhoods, also shrines or guilds, or even civic needs like firefighting. As industrialization increased, though, urban populations increased. People moved to the cities to find work in the factories. In terms of style and culture, Western cultural styles proliferated in Meiji Japan. They adopted the Gregorian calendar, a 7-day week with Sunday as a holiday. That was adopted in 1882. The metric system was adopted in 1886. Samurai began to cut off their top knot. You know, they had the shaved head with the top knot, and they preferred Western haircuts. The military wore Western-style uniforms. They encouraged meat eating, despite Buddhist practices. Readers read Western texts. Education was improved, and many excellent institutions were established throughout Japan, beginning with Tokyo University in 1886. So there were improvements there as well. In terms of gender relations, when the emperor was restored to the throne, so was male dominance in the home. Women and minors were prohibited from joining political organizations or attending meetings where political lectures were held. They even had the 1898 Civil Code, which reinforced patriarchy or male dominance in the home. At marriage, a woman's property passed to her husband. Fathers held exclusive custody rights over their children. High school education was extended to women, but the Girls' High School Law of 1899 was passed, declaring that its mission was to create, quote, good wives and wise mothers, unquote. So that was the purpose of their education. Within the home, women did have respect, but they weren't really allowed a place in public life of Japan. So, equality in the family of nations. From the beginning of Meiji Restoration, Japan wanted to end this practice of extraterritoriality and to regain control of their own tariffs, which they actually successfully did as they began to implement new political systems. In the early 1900s, there were two engagements with the West that pretty much solidified their status as a world power. The first one took place in 1902, and this was when Great Britain recognized Japan in a military pact on equal terms, bringing the two most powerful navies together, the two most powerful navies of Europe and Asia. But Great Britain recognized Japan as an equal. And then in 1904, in response to some Russian attacks, the Japanese attacked and took Port Arthur from Russia. They defeated the Russian army, and then they also defeated a Russian fleet that was annihilated by the Japanese Navy in 1905 as it crossed the Straits of Tsushima. Not to mention in 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, which established it as a world power, an international power. So we'll go ahead and end chapter 18 there.